Good evening, and welcome to Global Perspectives, our weekly program dedicated to dissecting complex international issues. Tonight, we delve into a particularly contentious and highly relevant question. Are international sanctions an effective tool against so-called rogue states? This is a strategy employed frequently by nations and international bodies, aiming to alter state behavior without resorting to armed conflict. However, its efficacy, morality, and unintended consequences are subjects of intense debate among policymakers, academics, and humanitarian organizations worldwide. To help us navigate this multifaceted issue, we have two distinguished guests with us tonight. Dr. Ben Carter, an esteemed international relations scholar who generally argues that sanctions are a crucial and often effective instrument of foreign policy, and Ms. Amina Al-Jamil, a prominent human rights advocate and economist who contends that sanctions are frequently ineffective and can inflict devastating harm on civilian populations. We will begin with opening statements from each of our guests, followed by a structured discussion and rebuttals, and finally, closing remarks. Our aim is to provide you, our audience, with a comprehensive understanding of the arguments from both sides.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this critical aspect of international diplomacy. When we speak of rogue states, we're generally referring to regimes that consistently violate international law, pursue weapons of mass destruction, support terrorism, or commit gross human rights violations against their own people. In such circumstances, the international community has a responsibility to act, and international sanctions represent a powerful, non-military tool to address these threats and compel a change in behavior. The primary purpose of sanctions is to exert pressure on a target state's leadership and its capacity to engage in undesirable activities. This can be achieved in several ways. Firstly, sanctions can cripple a regime's economy by restricting trade, freezing assets, and limiting access to international financial markets. This directly impacts their ability to fund illicit programs, military expansion, or oppressive internal security apparatuses. Secondly, they serve as a clear and unambiguous signal of international condemnation, isolating the rogue regime diplomatically and politically. This can erode its legitimacy both at home and abroad. History provides us with examples where sanctions, as part of a broader strategy, have contributed to positive outcomes. The multilateral sanctions against South Africa were instrumental in pressuring the apartheid regime to negotiate a transition to democracy. More recently, the targeted sanctions against Iran played a significant role in bringing Tehran to the negotiating table, eventually leading to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which aimed to curb its nuclear ambitions. Of course, sanctions are not a panacea, and their application requires careful consideration and strategic design. There can be unintended consequences, and regimes may attempt to circumvent them. However, the argument that they are inherently ineffective or always disproportionately harm civilians overlooks the evolution of sanctions regimes towards smart sanctions, which are designed to target specific individuals, entities, and sectors, thereby minimizing broader societal impact. Ultimately, in a world where military intervention is often too costly or too risky, well-designed and robustly enforced sanctions provide an indispensable middle ground option to uphold international norms and security. To abandon them would be to significantly weaken our collective ability to respond to serious global threats.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the opportunity to present a different perspective on this very serious matter. While Dr. Carter defines, quote, rogue states, it's important to acknowledge that this term itself can be politically charged and selectively applied, often by powerful nations to label those they disagree with, which can undermine the perceived legitimacy of sanctions from the outset. My primary contention is that comprehensive international sanctions, far from being an effective tool, often fail to achieve their stated foreign policy objectives, and, in the process, inflict catastrophic humanitarian damage on innocent civilian populations. We have seen, time and again, that broad economic sanctions, those that target an entire economy, lead to severe shortages of essential goods like food, medicine, and medical supplies. This results in increased malnutrition, higher child mortality rates, and the collapse of public health systems. The very people we claim to want to help are often the primary victims. Such suffering does not typically lead to popular uprisings against the regime. Instead, it can foster resentment towards the sanctioning bodies and paradoxically strengthen the regime's grip on power as it controls dwindling resources and blames external enemies for the hardship. Furthermore, the notion that sanctions effectively cripple rogue regimes' illicit activities is often an overstatement. Determined regimes become adept at circumventing sanctions through various means, developing sophisticated black markets, smuggling, relying on illicit trade in commodities like drugs or diamonds, or finding support from other states that have their own geopolitical reasons to defy the sanctions. The case of Iraq in the 1990s is a tragic and stark reminder of this. The comprehensive sanctions imposed then led to what UN officials themselves described as a humanitarian catastrophe, with hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, particularly among children, yet the regime remained firmly in power for over a decade. Even if sanctions do exert some economic pressure, there is little consistent evidence to suggest they lead to fundamental changes in a regime's core policies, especially when those policies are tied to the regime's survival or deeply entrenched ideological beliefs. Therefore, we must seriously question whether the often meager and uncertain political gains from sanctions can ever justify the profound and certain human suffering they cause. A more humane and, I would argue, more effective approach is needed.
Thank you both for those comprehensive opening statements. Ms. Al-Jamil, you've painted a very stark picture of the humanitarian consequences. Dr. Carter, Ms. Al-Jamil raises extremely serious concerns about the devastating humanitarian cost of sanctions, particularly when they impact vulnerable populations with food and medical shortages. How can the international community, or indeed the sanctioning powers, ethically justify this level of suffering, especially if, as Ms. Al-Jamil argues, the effectiveness in changing a regime's behavior is so often debatable and the regimes themselves become more entrenched?
That's an entirely valid and critical concern, Sarah, and one that the international community takes very seriously. No one desires to see civilians suffer, and the images and reports from heavily sanctioned countries can be deeply troubling. However, it's crucial to distinguish between the blunt instrument of older, comprehensive sanctions and the more modern, sophisticated approach of, quote, smart sanctions. These are specifically designed to target the assets, financial transactions, and travel of key regime figures, military entities, and sectors directly involved in prescribed activities, such as weapons proliferation or terrorism financing. The aim here is precision, to pressure those responsible for the problematic policies while minimizing, as much as humanly possible, the impact on the general populace. Humanitarian exemptions for food, medicine, and other essential goods are also typically built into these modern sanctions regimes, although their implementation can admittedly be complex. Furthermore, we must weigh the humanitarian cost of sanctions against the potential, or actual, humanitarian cost of inaction. If a rogue state is developing nuclear weapons, engaging in widespread ethnic cleansing, or sponsoring international terrorism, allowing such behavior to continue unchecked could lead to far greater suffering and loss of life in the long run. While it's true that determined regimes will always attempt to circumvent sanctions, to suggest they are easily or wholly bypassed, especially when sanctions are multilateral, well-enforced, and target specific financial vulnerabilities, is an oversimplification. We have seen financial pressure significantly constrain the options available to targeted entities. The goal isn't necessarily to cause an immediate collapse or a complete behavioral reversal overnight, but to degrade capabilities, increase the cost of illicit actions, and create leverage for diplomatic solutions that might otherwise be unattainable.
Dr. Carter, while the concept of, quote, smart sanctions sounds appealing in theory and certainly preferable to the devastating blanket sanctions of the past, their practical application and actual precision are often highly questionable. Even targeted sanctions can have significant spillover effects on the wider economy. When financial institutions are blacklisted, for instance, it can disrupt legitimate trade and access to essential imports because international banks become overly cautious, a phenomenon known as de-risking, which effectively cuts off even permitted transactions. Moreover, identifying the quote targets is an immense intelligence challenge, and mistakes can be made, penalizing innocent individuals or businesses. The mechanisms for delisting or correcting such errors are often slow and opaque. Regimes are also incredibly adaptive. They develop complex networks of front companies, use barter systems, exploit cryptocurrencies, and find alternative international partners to mitigate the impact of even these supposedly quote smarter measures. The elite often remain insulated, while the burden still trickles down to ordinary citizens who experience inflation, job losses, and reduced social services. And as for humanitarian exemptions, these are frequently difficult to navigate. The bureaucratic hurdles, the fear of secondary sanctions by financial institutions, and the disruption of supply chains mean that essential goods often don't reach those in need, or do so with significant delays and increased costs. So while the intent behind smart sanctions might be better, the reality on the ground for many civilian populations remains dire, and there's still a lack of compelling, widespread evidence that they consistently achieve the desired fundamental political change in deeply entrenched, authoritarian regimes without causing unacceptable collateral damage.
Some very strong counterpoints there, Ms. Al-Jamil, particularly regarding the practical effectiveness and reach of smart sanctions. Ms. Al-Jamil, Dr. Carter, has argued that sanctions, even with their imperfections, are a crucial tool, often the only viable one short of military conflict, for responding to states that violate international norms or threaten global security. If we were to significantly curtail the use of sanctions, or if they are as ineffective and harmful as you suggest, what are the realistic and potent alternatives for the international community to employ when faced with a regime actively pursuing dangerous agendas or oppressing its people?
That's a fundamental question, Sarah, and it's important to state that advocating against the overuse or misuse of sanctions is not advocating for inaction. There are indeed robust alternatives, often underutilized or prematurely abandoned in favor of punitive measures. Firstly, there is persistent, creative, and principled diplomacy and negotiation. This includes direct talks, mediation by third parties, and the use of international forums. Engagement, even with adversaries, is not appeasement. It is essential for understanding motivations, finding common ground, and de-escalating tensions. Secondly, we can offer positive incentives and conditional engagement. Instead of only using sticks, carrots can be more effective. This could involve phased easing of restrictions, offers of development aid, or technical assistance in return for verifiable steps in the right direction. Thirdly, there's the crucial role of supporting civil society, human rights defenders, and independent media within the targeted country. Empowering local actors who are working for democratic change and respect for human rights from within can be a far more sustainable path to reform than external coercion. Furthermore, international legal mechanisms, such as the International Criminal Court or ad hoc tribunals, can be utilized to hold individuals accountable for war crimes or crimes against humanity, which can act as a deterrent and provide justice for victims. Sanctions often punish the entire population for the crimes of a few. The problem is that sanctions can actively undermine these diplomatic efforts. They often create an atmosphere of hostility and mistrust, making negotiations more difficult. They can also empower hardliners within a regime who thrive on confrontation and isolation, thereby weakening the very moderates with whom we might seek to engage. A long-term strategy focused on engagement, incentives, and support for internal reform, while more complex and perhaps slower, offers a more constructive and ultimately more effective path than the often blunt and counterproductive instrument of sanctions.
Ms. Al-Jamil outlines a number of valuable diplomatic and supportive approaches, and I would agree that these should always be part of a comprehensive foreign policy toolkit. Diplomacy, engagement, and support for civil society are indeed vital. However, the crucial question is whether these methods alone are sufficient when dealing with regimes that are demonstrably unwilling to negotiate in good faith, that systematically deceive the international community, or that are actively engaged in activities that pose an imminent threat to regional or global stability. Diplomacy without leverage can often be an exercise in futility when one party has no incentive to compromise or change its behavior. Sanctions in this context are not necessarily an alternative to diplomacy, but can serve as a critical catalyst, creating that very leverage needed to bring a reluctant regime to the negotiating table and to make those negotiations meaningful. The idea of quote, or positive incentives is appealing, but some regimes may perceive such offers as weakness or an opportunity to extract concessions without making genuine changes. There needs to be a credible threat of negative consequences, the stick, to make the carrot more attractive. As for international legal mechanisms, while important for accountability in the long term, they are often slow and lack immediate coercive power to halt ongoing abuses or dangerous programs. Sanctions can provide a more immediate response. It's not an either-or situation. A well-calibrated strategy often involves a combination of pressure and engagement. Sanctions can create the conditions for more productive diplomacy by demonstrating the costs of continued defiance, effectively shaping the choices of the targeted regime. To remove that pressure tool, prematurely or entirely, would be to disarm ourselves in the face of serious challenges.
We're hearing compelling arguments from both of you, highlighting the deep complexities of this issue. Dr. Carter emphasizes sanctions as a necessary lever for diplomacy and a tool to curb dangerous activities, especially with the evolution towards smart sanctions. Ms. Al-Jamil, conversely, powerfully articulates the severe humanitarian costs, questions the true effectiveness even of targeted sanctions in achieving behavioral change, and advocates for alternatives centered on engagement and support for internal reform. The core of the debate seems to revolve around the actual versus intended impact of sanctions, whether they are a precise instrument of statecraft or a blunt tool with devastating and often counterproductive side effects, whether they serve as leverage or an obstacle to resolving conflicts. So, as we move towards our closing thoughts, I'd like to pose a final question to both of you. Looking ahead, what is the most critical change needed in how the international community approaches the issue of sanctions? Should the focus be on further refining sanctions to maximize their precision and effectiveness while minimizing harm, perhaps with clearer mechanisms for oversight and humanitarian relief? Or do we need a more fundamental rethink, perhaps a paradigm shift, away from sanctions as a primary tool towards other forms of international pressure and engagement?
Thank you, Sarah. In response to your crucial question, I believe a fundamental rethink is indeed necessary. While refinements to sanctions are always welcome, the inherent problems of collateral damage and questionable efficacy, even with smart designs, remain deeply concerning. We must move away from the default position of applying broad economic pressure that inevitably harms the most vulnerable. The human cost, the suffering inflicted on millions of innocent people in the name of geopolitical objectives, is a moral burden that the international community should no longer be willing to bear so readily. Therefore, the critical change is to elevate diplomacy, sustained engagement, and support for human rights and democratic movements from within as the primary tools. Sanctions, if ever considered, must be a genuine last resort, narrowly targeted, with clearly defined and achievable objectives, time-limited, and subject to rigorous independent monitoring of their humanitarian impact and effectiveness. There must be robust, easily accessible channels for humanitarian aid, and a clear commitment to lifting sanctions swiftly when conditions are met, or if they prove to be disproportionately harmful. We need a more humane, ethical, and ultimately, a more effective foreign policy.
Sarah, the path forward, in my view, lies not in a wholesale abandonment of sanctions, which would be a strategic error, but in their continued evolution and more judicious application as part of a comprehensive strategy. Sanctions, while imperfect, remain an indispensable instrument for upholding international law and security when faced with states that threaten peace, proliferate dangerous weapons, or systematically violate human rights. They fill a critical space between mere diplomatic protest and catastrophic military conflict. The focus must be on enhancing the, quote, smartness of sanctions, improving intelligence for precise targeting, strengthening multilateral cooperation and enforcement to prevent circumvention, and ensuring that humanitarian safeguards are not just clauses on paper, but are practically implemented and effective. Furthermore, sanctions should always be linked to clear, achievable diplomatic objectives, and be flexible enough to be eased or lifted when genuine progress is made. Abandoning this tool would leave the international community with fewer options to respond to aggression, potentially leading to greater instability, emboldening rogue actors, or making more forceful and far costlier interventions more likely in the future. Prudence dictates we refine the tool, not discard it.
Dr. Ben Carter, Ms. Amina Al-Jamil, thank you both for an incredibly insightful and thought-provoking discussion this evening. Your expertise and passionate arguments have truly illuminated the complexities surrounding international sanctions. It's clear that there are no easy answers. The debate over the efficacy, morality, and strategic utility of sanctions is ongoing, with deeply held convictions and compelling evidence presented on both sides. We've heard powerful arguments for sanctions as a vital tool for international leverage and behavior modification, and equally powerful arguments highlighting the profound humanitarian costs and questionable successes. We hope this discussion has provided our audience with a richer understanding of these different perspectives and the critical considerations involved when nations choose to employ such impactful measures.